The train came into Amber Fork a little after 4 in the afternoon, trailing steam and cinder against a sky the color of a bruise healing, and everyone on that platform believed they understood exactly what they were watching, which was a rancher named Caleb Whitfield, about to be made a fool of in front of the whole county. What they did not understand, what none of them could have understood standing there in their good coats with their arms crossed, was that the fool they expected to see kneel in humiliation was about to kneel for an entirely different reason, and that the reason would still be spoken of in Amber Fork long after the gossips who started the talk were dust themselves. If you have ever wondered what a man does with a promise he did not know he was making, stay until the end, because what happened on that platform was only the first small piece of it. Ruth Calloway stepped down from the passenger car with a girl's hand in each of hers, 2 small faces turned up against the wind, twin girls near 5 years old with the same brown eyes and the same solemn mouths, and the crowd's murmur rose the way water rises before it spills over a dam, because nowhere in the letters that had gone back and forth across 2 territories for the better part of a year had there been any mention of children. Caleb stood at the edge of the platform in the coat he wore to church twice a year, hat already off, and he did not flinch, did not step back, did not do any of the things the town had gathered to watch him do. He crossed the platform slowly, the way he crossed a field he did not want to spook, and when he reached them, he did not look first at the woman he had written to for 11 months. He went down on one knee in the dust in his good trousers so that his eyes were level with the girl's eyes, and he took off his hat again though it was already off, a nervous man's motion, and he asked them, quiet enough that only the 3 of them and the closest onlookers heard it, whether there might be room in their family for one more. That was all. Not a claim, not an apology. A question, offered the way a man offers a hand to a horse he wants to trust him first. To understand why a grown man would kneel in the dirt and ask 2 children's permission before he so much as looked at their mother, you have to go back to the winter 3 years before any of this, to a house Caleb Whitfield built with his own hands on a rise above Longmeadow Creek, a house with a room at the end of the hall he had framed out and finished and painted a pale yellow because his wife had wanted yellow, a room that was meant to hold a cradle, and did for exactly 9 days, before a fever took both the child and the mother in the space of one long night, while the roads were too deep in snow for the doctor in Amber Fork to reach them in time. Caleb buried them together, because it seemed wrong to separate them even in the ground, and afterward he did not tear the room apart the way some men might have. He shut the door instead. He kept the cradle. He built, in the 2 years that followed, without entirely admitting to himself why, a second small bed to match it, and a third, as though some part of him that did not consult the rest of him was still furnishing a future he no longer believed he was owed. The ranch prospered in the plain, unglamorous way ranches prosper when a man throws every waking hour at them instead of at his own grief, and by the 3rd winter Caleb Whitfield was known around Amber Fork as solid, fair, hard-working, and thoroughly alone, which his neighbor Hattie Voss, a widow herself and not a woman who minced words, told him plainly was a waste of good land and better sense. It was Hattie who finally pushed a folded advertisement across his kitchen table one evening, a notice for a matrimonial correspondence service out of the eastern states, and told him that a man could grieve forever or he could write one honest letter and see what came back. He wrote the letter. He did not dress up the truth in it, because dressing up truth was not a thing Caleb Whitfield knew how to do. He wrote that he was a widower with no children, that he ran cattle and put up his own hay, that he was not given to fine talk, and that he wanted, if it was not too plain a thing to want, someone to share a life with rather than simply occupy a house. The answer came back 6 weeks later in a hand that was neat and unhurried, from a woman named Ruth Calloway in a small town in Missouri, and her letter was, if anything, plainer than his own. She wrote that she was capable, that she did not frighten easily, that she had known hardship and was not ashamed of it, and that she had dependents she would explain in person rather than in a letter, which Caleb read at the time to mean an aging parent or a widowed sister, the sort of obligation men and women of that country carried without complaint. He wrote back that whatever she carried, He was not a man who ran from another person's burdens, which was true, though he did not yet know the size of the burden he was agreeing to. What Caleb did not know, and could not have known from 11 months of careful letters, was the life Ruth Calloway had been living in that small Missouri town, a life that had taught her early and thoroughly that plain honesty, offered too soon, closed more doors than it opened. Her husband, a quarryman named Amos Calloway, had died 2 years before in a rock slide that took 3 other men with him, leaving Ruth with twin daughters not yet 3 years old and a mother-in-law's grief that curdled fast into something colder. Amos's older brother, Silas Calloway, had never cared for Ruth, had said as much at the wedding in words meant to be overheard, and after Amos's death, Silas discovered a clause in his father's old will, tangled and half-forgotten, that suggested Calloway grandchildren belonged in some measure to Calloway land, meaning his land, meaning his say. He did not want the girls out of love. He wanted them the way a man wants a deed he believes is rightfully his, and he had begun, in the months before Ruth answered the matrimonial notice, to speak of lawyers, of guardianship, of what a widow with no husband and no income could reasonably be expected to provide 2 growing girls. Ruth had answered 2 other advertisements before Caleb's, and both men had written back warmly enough until she mentioned, honestly, that she came with 2 small daughters, at which point the letters stopped arriving altogether, because a woman with children was, to most men seeking brides by post, a different and lesser proposition than a woman alone. She learned from that the cost of saying everything too soon, so when she wrote to Caleb Whitfield, she told him the truth in careful pieces, dependents rather than daughters, planning all along to tell him the rest in person, where a man's face might show her something a letter could not, where she could watch how he greeted the truth instead of only reading his refusal in the silence of an unanswered post. She did not tell him about Silas at all. That was a different kind of truth, one she was not yet ready to hand to a stranger, however honest his letters seemed. She packed a single trunk, sold what furniture would not fit in it, and boarded a westbound train with Iris and Hazel Calloway on either side of her. 5 years old now, solemn-eyed and quiet in the way children become quiet when they have learned, too early, to read a room before they speak in it. She did not cry on that platform in Missouri. She had done her crying already, alone, at night, over the letters she had almost not sent. What she felt as the train pulled west was not hope exactly, and not fear exactly, but something closer to the flat, steady resolve of a person who has decided that whatever waits at the end of a journey cannot be worse than what she is leaving behind. And so she stepped off at Amber Fork with a daughter's hand in each of hers, and watched a stranger cross the platform toward her, and braced herself, the way she had braced herself twice before, for a face that would change the moment it understood what she had brought with her. His face did not change. He knelt instead, and asked the girls a question no one had thought to ask them, and something in Ruth Calloway's chest that had been clenched for 3 years loosened by perhaps 1 degree, which was not everything, but was, she would later say, a beginning. Iris, the bolder of the 2, studied him for a long moment, and then said there was room if he didn't snore, and Hazel, who did not yet trust her own voice around strangers, only nodded, and Caleb said that he had been told he snored some, but that he was willing to sleep in the barn if it came to that, which was the first joke anyone had heard him make in 3 years, and it startled a short laugh out of Ruth before she could stop it, a sound that surprised her more than it surprised him. He rose, dusted his knee, and only then looked properly at the woman he had written to for nearly a year, and what he found in her face was not what the town had gathered to see either, not desperation, not apology, but a kind of steady watchfulness, a woman taking his measure the same way he had just taken the measure of her daughters. He picked up her trunk without being asked and said only that the wagon was this way, and that was the whole of their first meeting. 4 sentences and a kneel and a joke about snoring. But it was enough in Amber Fork to end the talk before it properly started, because whatever the town had expected, it had not expected tenderness. The ride out to the Whitfield place took the better part of an hour, the road climbing steadily through country that opened wider with every mile, grass silvering under the last low sun, and Ruth sat beside Caleb on the wagon seat with the girls tucked between them and behind, and she found herself watching his hands on the reins, the easy competence of them, the way he pointed out a hawk without making a show of it, the way he slowed the horses without being asked when Hazel's face went pale over a rough stretch of road. A man's hands tell you things his letters cannot, she thought, and did not say. The house, when they reached it, was better built than she had allowed herself to expect, a long, low structure of good timber with a porch that ran its full width, and Caleb showed them through it with the plain, unadorned pride of a man who had built every board of it himself, the kitchen, the front room, the 2 bedrooms off the hall, and then, at the very end of that hall, a closed door. He paused in front of a moment too long before opening it. Inside was a room painted a pale, faded yellow, holding a cradle and 2 small beds, dust sheeted over all 3, and Ruth understood, without needing the explanation he gave her haltingly a few minutes later, standing in the doorway with his hat still in his hands, exactly what that room had been waiting for and exactly how long it had been waiting. He told her about his first wife and the fever and the 9 days, and he told it plainly, the way he told everything, without asking for pity and without offering more detail than the facts required. And when he finished, he said only that he had kept building beds he had no children for, and that he supposed now he understood why. Ruth did not offer comfort in words. She crossed the room instead, pulled the sheet off the smaller of the 2 beds, and told the girls this one was Hazel's and the other Iris's, and asked Caleb, in the same plain voice he had used on her, whether that suited him. He said it suited him fine. That was the whole of it. No declarations, no tears. A dust sheet folded and set aside and a room reassigned from grief to living children in, under a minute. And it was, in its quiet, practical way, the truest vow either of them made that first evening. They were married 11 days later by the circuit judge in Amber Fork, a brief, dry ceremony witnessed by Hattie Voss and the postmaster, because a household with 2 young girls and an unmarried man and woman under one roof was not a thing either of them wanted gossiped about longer than necessary, and because Ruth, though she did not say so aloud, wanted the protection of a legal name change for herself and, in time, for the girls, sooner rather than later. In the weeks that followed, the ranch settled into a rhythm that neither of them had quite dared to imagine in their letters. Ruth turned out to be a woman who did not wait to be told what needed doing. She had the kitchen reorganized within a week, put up preserves from a garden she found half wild and coaxed back into rows, and mended fence alongside Caleb on a Sunday afternoon with a competence that made him stop and simply watch her work for a moment before picking his own hammer back up. Iris attached herself to the barn and the animals with a fearlessness that had Caleb building her a small step stool within the month so she could reach the calves. Hazel attached herself, more quietly, to Caleb himself, following him at a careful distance until the day he noticed her shivering by the corral fence and, without a word, took off his own coat and settled it over her shoulders, after which she rarely left his side at all. Hattie Voss, riding over one afternoon with a jar of honey and an excuse she barely bothered to make convincing, watched the 4 of them at supper through the kitchen window and told Ruth afterward, with her usual bluntness, that she had never in her life seen a man so thoroughly rearranged by 2 small girls, and that it suited him better than his old silence had. It was, by any plain measure, a good beginning, and it was into this good beginning that the first small wrongness arrived, so quietly that Ruth almost missed it. A letter came for her in September, forwarded twice, the handwriting on the outside unfamiliar and cramped, and Ruth took it from the mail without comment, read it alone in the yard with her back to the house, and put it away in the bottom of her trunk instead of on the shelf where she kept the rest of her correspondence. Caleb noticed. He noticed the way a careful man notices weather changing before the clouds have fully gathered, and he said nothing about it at the time, because it was not yet his place to ask, and because Ruth had given him, in every other way, no reason to doubt her. But the next month, another letter came, and then a third in November, each one read alone and put away in the same place, and each time Ruth's face afterward carried a stillness that had not been there before she opened them. When he finally asked, gently, over supper one evening, whether everything was well with her family back east, she said yes, a little too quickly, and changed the subject to whether the roof over the barn would hold through another winter. And Caleb, who was not a man to push, let it go, though he did not forget it. Hattie brought the second thread of it in December, riding over in weather cold enough that Ruth scolded her for coming at all, and mentioned, between sips of coffee, that a stranger had been asking after them in town, a man in a good coat who had stopped at the general store and the land office both, asking whether anyone knew a Ruth Calloway and whether she had married a local rancher, and whether that rancher was a man of any means. Ruth's hand went still around her own cup. Hattie noticed that too, though she was tactful enough not to say so outright, only adding, in the same easy tone, that she'd told the man nothing worth repeating, because it was nobody's business but Ruth's, and that whoever he was, he hadn't much liked being turned away without answers. Caleb asked Ruth that night, once the girls were asleep and the house had gone quiet around them, who the stranger might be, and for the first time since the platform at Amber Fork, Ruth Calloway did not answer him plainly. She said it was nothing, that Amos's family had never much cared for her, and it was probably only idle curiosity, and she said it looking at the fire rather than at him, and Caleb, watching her, understood that whatever she was carrying, she had not yet decided to set it down in front of him. He did not press her that night. He only said, quietly, that a closed door in a house was one thing, but a closed door between two people who slept under the same roof was another, and that he hoped, whenever she was ready, she would open it. Then he banked the fire and went to bed, and Ruth sat up a while longer with the untouched fourth letter in her lap, the one that had come that very week, and that she had not yet had the courage to open. The letter, when she finally did open it 2 days later, was from Silas Calloway himself, and it was not idle curiosity at all. It informed her, in the flat legal language of a man who had paid a lawyer for exactly this purpose, that he intended to petition the courts for guardianship of Iris and Hazel Calloway, on the grounds that their late father's family was better positioned to provide for their upbringing and their inheritance than a widow who had, in Silas's words, absconded west to marry a stranger, rather than accept her rightful place among family. He wrote that he would be traveling to the territory himself in the spring to see the matter settled, one way or another, and that Ruth would do well to consider what a long, public, expensive legal fight might cost a new marriage already burdened, as he put it, with children that were not the new husband's own. Ruth read the letter twice, standing alone in the yard in the thin winter light, and then she did something she had not let herself do since the night Amos died, which was sit down on the cold ground and cry until she had nothing left in her to cry with. It was Caleb who found her there 20 minutes later, having come looking when she did not answer his call for supper, and it was the sight of her on the frozen ground with the letter crumpled in her fist that finally broke whatever restraint had kept her silent for 4 months. She told him everything that evening, sitting across the kitchen table with the girls asleep down the hall, and the letter flattened out between them. Told him about Amos and the quarry, and Silas's coldness even at the wedding, about the old will and its half-forgotten clause, about the 2 other advertisements she had answered honestly, and the silence that had followed both, about why she had written dependents instead of daughters, and said nothing at all about a brother-in-law who wanted her children the way a man wants a deed he believes is rightfully his. She told him, at the end of it, in a voice gone thin with the effort of the telling, that she had been afraid if he knew the whole of it before she arrived, he would have written back the same silence the other 2 men had, and that she had let herself hope, once she saw his face on that platform, that the silence might never have to come at all. Caleb sat with all of it a long while without speaking, and the silence in that kitchen was not the comfortable kind they had grown used to over the months, but something heavier, and Ruth watched his face for the change she had been dreading since Missouri. Watched for the moment his eyes would go the way the other men's eyes had gone in her imagination if she had ever told them the truth. It did not come, not exactly, But something in him did close, briefly, the way the door at the end of the hall had once been closed, and he asked her, in a voice more careful than angry, whether she had married him to keep her daughters safe from a man 3 states away, or because she meant to build a life with him at all. It was a fair question, and a hard one, and Ruth did not flinch from it, though it cost her to answer plainly. She said that she did not know in Missouri which of those 2 things it would turn out to be, and that she had told herself she would find out honestly once she arrived, rather than pretend a certainty she did not feel, and that somewhere in the months since, watching him with her daughters, watching him work a fence line or carry a sleeping Hazel in from the porch, the answer had stopped being a question of safety at all. She said that if he sent her away now, it would not be the letter's fault, and it would not be Silas's fault, but she would understand it, because she had not given him the whole truth when the whole truth might have mattered most. Caleb did not answer that night. He rose from the table, banked the fire without a word, and walked instead down the hall to the room at the end of it, the room with the 2 small beds now slept in every night by children who were not his by blood, and might, if a Missouri court had its way, not remain his by law either. And he sat there a long while in the dark, among the things he had built for a family he lost, and a family he had only just begun to claim. And Ruth, lying awake in the next room, listened to the silence of him not coming to bed and understood it as an answer she was not ready to hear. He came back before morning, though, sat on the edge of their bed while she pretended to sleep, and said only, into the dark, that he had built that room for children he never got to raise, and that he was not about to let some man's reading of a dead man's will decide who got to raise these 2 instead. Ruth did not answer, because her throat would not let her, but she reached back and found his hand in the dark and held it. And that was answer enough for both of them. Silas Calloway arrived in Amber Fork in the first warm week of April, exactly as he had promised, and he did not come alone. He brought a lawyer from the territorial capital and a set of papers drawn up to look, to an unlettered rancher's eye, considerably more official and threatening than they actually were. He rode out to the Whitfield place, uninvited, on a Tuesday afternoon, found Caleb mending fence with Iris perched on the top rail handing him nails, and introduced himself with the stiff formality of a man who has rehearsed his opening line, informing Caleb that he had come to discuss the matter of the Calloway children's guardianship, and that he trusted a reasonable man could see the sense in a family arrangement over a stranger's charity. Caleb set down his hammer, told Iris to run and fetch her mother, and waited, arms crossed, until Ruth came out onto the porch with Hazel's hand in hers, before he answered Silas at all. He said that he had read the letter Silas sent his wife, that he understood a dead man's will could be read a good many ways by a good many lawyers, and that he was not interested in arguing law with a man who had brought his own lawyer along to do the arguing for him. Silas, misreading the plainness of this for weakness, offered then what he had clearly come prepared to offer, a sum of money in exchange for Caleb's cooperation in the guardianship petition, framed as compensation for a man who had, after all, only known these girls a few months and could hardly be expected to feel the pull of blood the way family did. It was Ruth who answered before Caleb could, stepping off the porch with a fire in her that Silas had apparently not expected from the woman he remembered, telling him plainly that no sum of money would buy her daughters and that he ought to be ashamed to have ridden this far to offer one. But it was Caleb's answer, quiet and unhurried, that ended the conversation. He said that there was no room on this ranch or in this family for the kind of arithmetic Silas was proposing, that a girl was not a line item in a will and never would be under his roof, and that if Silas wanted a fight in front of a territorial judge, he would find Caleb Whitfield standing in that courtroom beside his wife with adoption papers already filed, rather than waiting to be asked. This last was not entirely true when he said it, but it was true within the week, because Caleb rode into Amber Fork the very next morning and sat across from Judge Pryor for the better part of 2 hours, laying out the whole matter plainly, the way he laid out everything, and the judge, who had known Caleb Whitfield most of his adult life and had married him to Ruth himself, agreed to expedite what paperwork could be expedited and to make plain, in writing, that the girl's legal father now stood in this territory, married to their mother under the law, and prepared to contest any claim brought against that fact. Silas's lawyer, presented with this development a week later, advised his client privately that a Missouri court was unlikely to overturn a lawful marriage and a filed adoption in favor of an uncle's reading of an ambiguous clause, and that the cost of pursuing it further would likely exceed whatever satisfaction Silas imagined he would feel in winning. Silas left Amber Fork on the next eastbound train, and whatever he told himself about the matter afterward, he never wrote to Ruth Calloway again. The adoption was finalized that summer, a plain document signed in Judge Pryor's office with Hattie Voss standing witness once more, and Caleb told Ruth afterward, walking back to the wagon with the papers folded in his coat pocket, that it was the second most important document he had ever signed, the first being the one that had married them. And Ruth said that she supposed that made her daughters the only thing in his life more important than his own wife, which was the second joke Caleb Whitfield ever made in front of her, though this time it was her joke and not his, and he laughed properly all the way to the wagon. The seasons turned the way they do on a working ranch. Without much ceremony, hay cut and stacked, cattle moved and moved again, snow coming and going, and the house on the rise above Longmeadow Creek filled with the ordinary noise of two growing girls, Boots by the door in a size that changed twice a year, a step stool eventually too small for the barn and rebuilt taller, a pale yellow room down the hall that no longer needed dust sheets because it was slept in every single night. Hattie Voss remained a fixture at the kitchen table on Sunday afternoons, and it was Hattie who observed, one autumn evening, a little more than 2 years after the train had first pulled into Amber Fork, that Caleb Whitfield had become, against all early evidence, one of the most talkative men in the county on the subject of his own daughters, which she considered proof that miracles occurred even in places as unremarkable as this one. It was on just such an evening, the light going long and gold across the yard, that a half-starved dog wandered up the road and sat itself down at the bottom of the porch steps, watching the family at supper with the patient hope of a creature that had learned to ask for very little and hope for a great deal. Iris saw it first through the window and came off her chair at a run, and it was Hazel, quieter Hazel, who had grown steadier and braver with every year in that house, who knelt down in the yard the way she had once seen a stranger kneel on a train platform and looked that dog square in its hopeful eyes and asked it, in a voice that carried her father's plainness and her mother's steadiness both, whether there might be room for one more. Caleb, standing in the doorway with Ruth beside him, watched his daughter ask the question he had once asked her, and found that his throat had gone tight in a way he did not try to explain to anyone, not even himself. Ruth slipped her hand into his on the porch and said quietly that it seemed there was always room in this family for one more, and Caleb said that he supposed that was true, and had been true since the day a woman stepped off a train with 2 small hands in hers, and more courage than the whole of Amber Fork had given her credit for. The dog stayed. It was given no name for a week, until Iris settled on one, and it slept, for the rest of its long, comfortable life, on the porch just outside the pale yellow room at the end of the hall. The room that had once been shut against grief and was now and would remain simply and permanently full.